Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Annika Nordquist. Today's guest is an old friend and really fascinating man, Dr. Michael Auslin, who is the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow in Contemporary Asia at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He's a historian who specializes in U.S. policy in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, and the author of 6 books on that subject. He was previously an associate professor of history at Yale and a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a podcaster himself as the host of The Pacific Century. But today, we're here to talk about his new project on the history of Washington, D.C. He's been publishing a Substack on it called The Patowmack, P-A-T-O-W-M-A-C-K, Packet, which gives regular updates on his research on the subject and is linked in the show notes. So with no further ado, I hope you enjoy. Michael, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you on.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Annika. I'm really happy to be here and talk with you.
Well, so this topic is a bit of a pivot for you. You've been an Asia expert for many, many years, and you're also not a DC native. So I say with slight smugness, being a DC native myself.
Now I'm nervous. I'm speaking to a DC native, so all of us carpetbaggers. I mean, we're on warning now. We're on our guard.
Well, technically Virginia native. Some people get picky about that. But so talk a little bit about why you're interested in this topic, why you're making this pivot, and why you think that this topic is under-discussed or important for you to delve into.
Yeah, it's a good point and irony, right? The pivot was supposed to be to Asia. I'm pivoting away
Yes.
from Asia. I mean, not entirely, obviously. I mean, I'm still, looking at it from different angles. But, I came to Washington, D.C. first in the, obviously this will date me, but in the mid-1980s to go to college. I went to Georgetown and went to the School of Foreign Service. So the whole idea was, you're going to go to the Capitol to learn how to act in the world. And then came back after a lapse of actually over 20 years to come back to D.C., and realized when I got here as an adult, still having done the, sort of America in the world work for most of my career, that I didn't know anything about DC, which, maybe not surprising as a callow undergraduate, which I certainly was and won awards for callowness. That I just didn't pay attention to my surroundings. You come to DC, you're like, wow, it's either White House or Capitol. Those are one of the two things that you focus on, maybe, CIA or something like that. But the city, I mean, I didn't know much about it, like most Americans. I didn't know about it in both as a city, as an actual urban spot, right? There is a city outside of the government, but I also didn't really know anything at all about how it had developed as a government, as a government site. But it's very different, when you're ostensibly an adult and you have a family and you move into a neighborhood and you suddenly start seeing these things. And I started thinking, well, why is my neighborhood here? Literally, I like, why isn't this farmland still? And my neighborhood was built, starting the entire development was built starting in the mid-1950s. And so it was here for one reason, because of the Cold War. And before that, it had been farmland. And that started a chain of both thoughts as well as just interest in saying, okay, so what's the bigger story of how Washington became the Washington that I work in, and so many others work in, obviously not just me, but also the Washington that the tourists see. And they see, essentially the monumental Washington, the monumental core, but there's so much more to it. And I think, I hope, and I mean, I feel pretty sure, although I don't know if I'll be the one to so successfully capture this, but, I think there is a connection between Washington as a government city and as an urban site, and the larger American experience. We are, I don't want to, I come from Chicago, which in my mind, as a historian, I will say is still the second largest city in the country. I'll never give that up. Just like the Sears Tower is still called the Sears Tower and is still the tallest building in America. Some things for me will never change, but we're used to thinking about cities like New York, LA, Chicago, some of the newer ones like Dallas and newer, but you know what I mean, coming into prominence, Miami, later on. But very little has been thought about Washington as a city because most people just think of it as the capital. And so they disregard both the urban experience, or what I would call the district, versus Washington, the which is formally Washington City, or the federal city is Washington, and it's in this larger district. So the difference between the district's own experience, that's often ignored by Americans, again, as well as the fact that it wasn't always this monumental city that we see. So that's really been the genesis of trying to understand the nexus, let's say, of urban development, government development, foreign policy, public space, a lot of sociology, social issues, but cultural and intellectual development as well. And I at least haven't found any, sort of one source that brings that all together. And that's, hopefully over time what I'll be able to do.
Wow, really fascinating. In your Substack on this topic, the Patowmack, I'll enunciate it especially. Patowmack Packet. You have this great quote where you compare the experience of living in DC to Augustan Rome or Victorian London, because it's a world capital at the height of its power. And especially as someone with a love of history, and who, grew up around DC and, like you, probably didn't think much about it for a very long time. It's a really striking comparison. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the parallels, I suppose, between the way that DC presents itself and presents the American empire, in comparison with those eras.
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's hopefully what I'll be working on for a long time. So I don't have full answers right now, but
we can start with an overview.
I'll start with the overview, the 30,000 foot. I mean, I'll start with where you pulled a quote from the blog, Substack. I'm not 100% clear what all these differences are, but it allows me to publish what I want when I want, and that's really what I care about. The Patowmack Packet is, so I got here, again, just as I was mentioning earlier, I got here at the end of the Cold War, but of course nobody knew it was quite the end of the Cold War.
Right.
I mean, you could probably sort of see that it wasn't going to last forever, but nobody knew for sure. So I was in Washington at a time where it was the Reagan era. There was undoubtedly a sense of sort of renaissance and revitalization, but also vastly increasing threat that we were pushing to medium range ballistic missiles into Europe. There had been war scares in 1983. There was, of course, a view shared by many on the left that Reagan was a madman cowboy who would get us into nuclear war. And so you were in the city. It may not have been a Cuban Missile Crisis. It may not have been the Eisenhower years, but it certainly was, arguably one of the two most important cities on earth at the time, Moscow and Washington. We used to joke a lot at Georgetown that if the sirens went off and you knew you had a minute or two, assuming the sirens ever went off, because don't forget, I was also the day after generation, right? The ABC, I think it was ABC, right? Miniseries on nuclear war. There was also Red Dawn, but that wasn't quite nuclear war. But there's, it was the day after, so it's like we may not be here. Obviously, we never got. Well, we actually did get very close with the 1983 scare, Stanislav Petrov, but nobody knew at the time, versus something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where people were saying, we don't know if we'll be here tomorrow. So we always used to joke, but joke is sort of like, very dark humor, but that if they let the sirens go off to warn us the end was nigh, could we make it from campus down the Exorcist steps to the Key Bridge in time to watch it all go. This was very mordant because, again, there was a lot of fear. We just, you didn't really know how this was going to turn out. And for someone who was so young at the time, it was honestly, it wasn't Cuban Missile Crisis where it's like, wow, we really could be gone tomorrow. It was exhilarating. And so that exhilaration to some degree transferred to the location you were at, right? You were in Washington. And so it's a long way of getting to your question about looking at, there is something in all cities. I find them fascinating, from ancient Sumer onwards, but there is something particular and unique, I would argue, about being in the most powerful or the most important, or however you want to judge it, city at or around the peak of its power. That's a unique historical moment, and I think, and something I hope I'll be able to capture, in the blog, the Patowmack Packet, and whatever else may come out of it, capture some of the ordinary sense, because my presumption is that people who did live here and do live here at this time see things probably a little bit differently. I'm not saying better. I'm not saying smarter. I'm not saying they have better insight, but there's probably a bit more buy-in, if I can put it that way, to what's going on in terms of national policy and international policy, potentially than, if you lived somewhere lovely and important to you, but, maybe not where truly global decisions are being made. And, and there are few cities in history where you can say that unambiguously. Rome would have been one,
right?
Under, Caesars, whether it's Augustus or Hadrian or Trajan or whomever. I don't think Constantinople rises to it. Peking, Beijing, the old, under the Chinese Empire, possibly, certainly because of its sway throughout an entire regional world system. That certainly I think is a great candidate. But Victorian London as well, right? Where decisions made in London affected Siam and affected Java and affected the Northwest Pacific coast. So Washington is like that. And but I guess what interests me is the idea that these policies, you can look at them sort of maybe taking what you might say is a realist paradigm of policymaking. They're not black boxes, they're like a realist, if I am not confusing myself, which I probably am. They see the world, they see states as a black box, meaning it doesn't really matter what goes on inside. You don't need to know, because in an anarchic world system, they will all act the same to maximize security or advantage or whatever it might be. And that may be true, but I also think that there is an environment. It's almost biological without, I'm not a Spenglerian, the civilizations are like organisms, but there is an environment, almost biological, in which all of this takes place, and in which the decisions that are made by a fairly small group of people, but all of whom interact and live with each other and feed off each other in ways that are not simply 9 to 5 in the office, right? There are communities and networks and neighborhoods. Georgetown is probably the best example when you look at, let's say the Kennedy years or the 1950s. And so that interests me. But then there's another whole side of the district that, interestingly, is not part of this directly. It doesn't make policy. But it is within that, I hate the term, but I'll use it anyway, the ecosystem of Washington. And so what's that like? One thing that interests me, for example, what did the Cuban Missile Crisis look like from Anacostia, for example? Did it look any different from Georgetown? I mean, in one way, it's presumptuous to even assume that, because people are people. And if you think you're not going to be here tomorrow, it doesn't matter what your race or class or gender or religion is. You're worried you and your kids won't be here tomorrow. But on the other hand, those who were making the decisions were living in Georgetown and Alexandria and McLean, let's say, and certainly had better information than the rest of us. But their neighbors may have known nothing, even those in McLean, and certainly those in Anacostia or Southeast or Southwest. And so there's just this whole side to me of Washington as a society
Hmm.
that at least I want to try to explore and understand again what it was like through this period of America growing to become the world power, how the city changed. And it changed in many ways. It changed physically, it changed culturally, it changed socially, it changed intellectually. Um, and I, at least, like I said, haven't seen that fully captured somewhere, but I think we have lots of books on London. There's a great one called London 1900, so it's like the peak, the end, but the peak of Victorian power. You have so many books on Rome, and yet not really what I've found. There are many histories of Washington, but not one that places it in the context of Washington, essentially an international history in a way told from the streets of Washington, but understanding what that history does to Washington.
The classicist in me wants to ask what Constantinople ever did to you, not to qualify, but I promise I'm going to stay on track here.
I'd love to answer. No, because I love Constantinople. And I think it's just because it did not control a world system the way that Rome did. I mean, I think the tragic beauty of Constantinople is that I'll get us back on track, but I can't avoid the question. The tragic beauty of Constantinople is that it was only really, except for a very short period under Justinian when they recaptured Spain and Italy and Gaul. It was always, first of all, it was never really Rome. It never lived. It was not the Rome of the Western Empire when it was controlling the whole empire, and it was always struggling for survival. And so I actually think there are incredible lessons for capitals from the history of Constantinople, but not the golden age and apogee. I think it's the silver age at best, or the autumn and the senescence of a world system rather than the golden age. And so actually it is a good point that you make, because at least since 9/11, we have been arguing in this country about A, whether we're Rome and therefore at some point heading for a fall, or B, the decline has already set in. And there have been tons of books written on both those topics, but all those books and articles and arguments of overstretch and imperial overstretch and the decline of America, which, interestingly can be taken from both external and domestic, right? George Packer's The Unraveling, right? I think that's the title, looks at how we're coming apart at home. Also the title of a great book by Charles Murray. But then there's all the, imperial blowback. And so the Constantinople question is actually one that we don't want to get to. That's what's so interesting about it, is you don't want to get to Constantinople, even though it had incredible philosophy, incredible intellectual and cultural achievements. It was not determining a world system. It was simply trying to survive. And so those who argue that, yes, Rome lived another 1,000 years after the putative fall of the Western Empire in 476, it did, but it, and of course, pre-476, it had already lost so much of the position that it had. And so really serious questions about how do you avoid that? And again, those decisions are largely, though not exclusively, made in Washington, meaning other nations get a vote. The elephant in the room is China. Will China create a new world system? Will Beijing supplant Washington the way Washington supplanted London? That's the great policy debate of our time. So of course, China gets a vote, right? China can do good things that increase its power, and it can do stupid things that decrease its power. But so much of the answer to that question lies with us. Do we hollow out our industry further? Do we continue to slide in the educational tables? Do we no longer become the land of opportunity for people, whether native born or immigrants, to create new businesses and new opportunities, which eventually means you will not have enough national wealth to field the type of military that has upheld the trading system that has given you so much wealth to allow you to dominate the system and in fact shape it. All of those are the questions that and it's why 2,000 years later we still look at Rome, because we want to understand the mistakes that they made. And that's really a posit for a city like Washington. So as I mentioned to you in a different conversation, I'm currently halfway through Gibbon's Decline and Fall. I've read 3 of the 6 volumes.
Which is very impressive, by the way, to the listeners. A long book.
Not if they knew how slowly I read it. They would actually wonder if, he needs someone to read it to him. But it is it is without question the greatest history written in English, bar none, mic drop. But there are still so many lessons, incredible lessons and really important ones. I'm trying to get my head around thinking about some of them in terms of policy for Washington, because there's so much you can do wrong, obviously, when you're so powerful, and sometimes so little you can do right when you're weak. And Rome insensibly slid into weakness, the Western Empire, losing Africa, losing Gaul, losing Spain, so that it no longer could do good when it was weak, whereas you look earlier and it could do ridiculously wasteful things in Germania and other places when it was strong, because it had the resilience to bounce back. And that's really the question that we face today, is which path and how much can you choose it? Can you choose to avoid decline without being a fatalist? Meaning, sometimes you get into a condition where you may not be able to turn it around. And again, those are decisions that are made here. So all of this sounds like I'm just talking about policy, and that's obviously a huge part of it. But there is something more. There is something. Again, if you look at Washington sociologically, it helps. I hope it helps to explain some of those decisions. Again, hubris. Does hubris just come because you don't understand what you're trying to do? You just think it's going to work out? Does it come because you're just simply, again, in a black box way, so arrogant, we're going to do whatever we want around the world? Or is hubris somehow baked into or not baked into, but part of the environment here again? So that's that sociological element. You can never, I think, and I'm not a sociologist, you can never, I think, fully or with certainty tease out the sociological inputs into a policy decision. Although, you may have some listeners out there who are screaming right now saying, of course you can. And if that's true, please email me, auslin@stanford.edu, or please email Annika and she'll get it to me, so I know what to read. But again, there is a sort of sociological element and these decisions that are made. And I'm talking now, and I'll let you get back to the next question. I'm sorry, but I've been talking now sort of about the end process, which of course the time, we don't know if it's the end, but I'm saying after a long arc of history has already passed, we are living in that moment, and we don't know whether we go, whether it's the next American century or it's the Chinese century or what. I mean, obviously I wrote a book called The End of the Asian Century, so I'm sort of banking that it won't be the Chinese century. But really what I want to look at is that whole incredible arc that got us here. So that period of growth and development in DC that simply allowed, abetted, and reflected in an iterative process, a cycle, allowed America to become, the greatest world power since Rome, maybe in history.
I think that's a great transition to starting to go kind of through the history of DC chronologically. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the geography, because that's been a big focus of your blog. If you go back in time before there was European settlement in this region, what are some of the things that are unique about it?
So the area where Washington is today on the Potomac River, actually the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, was actually one of the most important centers and trading routes for the Indian tribes, the American Indian tribes in this area, the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac. So Potomac is an incredible river. Most people just think about the mile or so that fronts the monumental core of the city, but it's a 400-mile long river. It rises in right at the border of what is today West Virginia and Maryland. And of course, it goes all the way down, empties into the Chesapeake Bay, or as I like to remind my friends in San Francisco, the real bay.
I'm going to have to steal that from you.
The much more beautiful Blue Bay. And I guess I hope that no one from Stanford or Hoover is listening to this right now. But I'm assuming that since this is a Princeton podcast, it's just going to reach the East Coast folks. Anyway, no, the Potomac's an incredible river. And, it obviously is. Okay, George Washington wanted it to be what the Ohio, Mississippi, Missouri river system is. He really thought it was going to be, and built, the Potomac Canal, built the locks. He invested. And so if you go back to the beginning of the country, it wasn't inconceivable because the Potomac reached the closest directly into the Ohio Valley, which at that time was the far frontier and the richest part of the country. And so it was conceivable, as Washington and Jefferson both saw it, that the Potomac would be the main river. Now, today, of course, we know that didn't happen. The canals, both the Potomac and the Chesapeake in Ohio, did not work out. They were dramatically and instantaneously superseded by the Erie Canal and the connection to the Great Lakes. And of course, as an old Northwesterner from Chicago, the old Northwest, I'm very proud that the Great Lakes led to the great development of this country. But we overlooked the Potomac and how important it was in favor of the other rivers. And so here you had it was the Indians here were part of the Algonquian family of the linguistic family that stretched all the way from Canada all the way down south, with different affiliations and tribes. The most important in this area were the Powhatans, and those are down really on where Jamestown is, the James River stretching up through the northern neck. And then in our area, the Piscataways, the Nankachanks, which is where or the Anacostans, and of course the Patowmacks, the Potomacs, who are a little bit farther south. So it was a crossroads. The Susquehanna came down into the bay, and then you meet where the Potomac is. So all the tribes were trading. You had the Eastern Shore tribes as well, the Eastern Shore of Maryland and the smaller Eastern Shore Peninsula of Virginia. And they had been here, obviously, for untold millennia, had confederacies, had alliances, had devastating wars. Powhatans were really the power base, and those were the ones that John Smith is engaging with early on, and of course ultimately are reduced to largely impotence by over time by the eruption of European, mainly English settlers in this region. Although if you look at the Susquehannas, there's the Swiss and the Dutch and the Germans moving into that area as well. But it's an incredibly vibrant. We think of the Plains Indians. I grew up on the Plains more or less, right? So we think of the Plains Indians and we think of the Far West Indians. But here was incredibly, incredibly important. And it was important to get to your geological question briefly, because uniquely, Washington sits along the fall line of the Potomac, but it's actually the Atlantic seaboard fall line that stretches all the way up, quite frankly, to Manhattan, which is also on the fall line and then down. And that's, fall lines were the last navigable point on rivers before they hit cataracts, waterfalls. They became too rocky to navigate up. So a lot of towns were founded on the fall lines. Towns that, in New Jersey and Philadelphia, but stretching down to Washington as well. And so what we have here is the confluence to the east of the Atlantic coastal plain and to the west of the Piedmont Plateau. Now, both of those are part of actually larger geographic regions, although mostly we talk about those. But the Piedmont is part of the larger Appalachian range, which stretches all the way to where largely the Great Plains start past the Appalachian Mountains, the flat Midwest. And then there is the coastal plain, and then the Atlantic coastal shelf, actually, which extends the continent out into into the Atlantic Ocean. And so it's really unique. And you see that geography as you walk around Washington, or you walk around Rock Creek, which is the very edge. Rock Creek Park is the very edge of the Piedmont Plateau. It's rocky, it's stony, it's very old rocks, 500 million years to a billion-year-old rocks. And then The Atlantic coastal plain is the sediments that over millennia, tens and hundreds of millennia, have been washed up, forming a bed on top of the stony, rocky plains from a few inches to thousands of feet thick. And so that changes the topography. And it's actually why Washington is a swamp, because it cuts through the two meet on a northeast to southwest diagonal. And the low-lying lands along the Potomac frontage, which most of which are landfill now, they were swampy because it was where the coastal plain was coming to its end. And so we always talk about the swamp metaphorically. We talk about it in terms of weather, and it is a nice steamy day here in mid-ish spring now in Washington.
Steamy and getting steamier. It's only getting worse.
It's going to be getting worse. And, I used to hate it. And now I sort of like, yeah, now I know why, right? Because again, we're at this confluence. So the geography of Washington is really important. And it's also why George Washington, it's why Alexandria, which I know is where you're from, was founded is actually founded 275 years ago this year in 1749 to be a tobacco trading port. Georgetown was founded 2 years later in 1751 to also be a tobacco trading port and inspection station. George Washington thought that you could have produce brought all the way along the Appalachian plain, all the way down to the plateau and the plain, all the way down from the Ohio Valley through the entire Potomac, get it into the coastal plain, get it down to the Chesapeake Bay and out into the Atlantic. And all of that history has sort of been lost because we just think about Washington as the site of the White House, right? But it really was thought by the founders that this was going. Washington said it would become the great emporium of America. And it didn't. And it was actually in many ways good that it didn't.
We've now touched on two of kind of the greatest hits from American history, John Smith and George Washington. Washington's named after Washington. So it's not totally shocking that he had such a major role in the early development of the city. But there's sort of the traditional story about why Washington, D.C. is in Washington, which is that it was a compromise between North and South, yada, yada, yada. And I think kind of reading through your blog, part of me was like, maybe it was just because Washington founded America and he said, this is where I'm from, this is where it's going to be. And there's honestly something kind of beautiful about that the person who engineered the nation also in a very serious way engineered the capital city. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that, to Washington's role in the region.
Yeah, absolutely.
George Washington, not
George
the
Washington.
Yes.
No. You're completely right. Again, Washington, the man, the monument man, not the monument, but the man who is a monument. We think of him in terms of obviously, setting all the precedents for Republican government, small r Republican government. But he was a developer. He was a surveyor. He owned tens of thousands of acres out in the Ohio Valley. He was a developer. And we've learned that about Mount Vernon. By the way, when I was growing up, Mount Vernon was just Washington's home. Now we know, there was a distillery that has been refounded and they market, Mount Vernon whiskey. He was experimenting with different types of crops. He was a big hemp grower, which was a huge export, right? Hemp for making ropes and cordage and for ships. So Washington really was an economist in many ways, in the old sense of the word, of an agricultural economist. And all self-taught. That's what's so amazing about him. Didn't go to Harvard like Adams, didn't go to William and Mary like Jefferson. He was self-taught. And his stature was so extraordinary that when Congress decided on this deal, which was right, it was the North agreed to have the capital basically in the South, though it's really in between the North and the South, but to have it down there, i.e. not have it in New York or Philadelphia. And the South agreed then to have the federal government take over the Revolutionary War debts and really centralize finances, the Hamilton Plan. They all said, well, let George Washington pick where it should be. There really wasn't an argument about that. And they gave him, there were instructions, but some latitude. He was able to pick a spot basically between the Little Falls of the Potomac and all the way down past the Anacostia. I forget the exact range. I just read it a little while ago, but anyway, there was a range, and he could pick 10 square miles and fix the site. And of course, Mount Vernon was a little bit down the river, and Alexandria was a little bit closer. But he thought that was the spot. Whether he thought so because the Anacostia, which today is really an overlooked river, but was significant back then. I really think, in his view, it was going to be trade, because he thought that this would be the great emporium. And so he picked it. There was never any real question. Once he decided, Congress couldn't agree where the capital should be earlier, right? That was the log rolling. And it was the first Congress. We number them, right? This was the first Congress, was already politically deadlocked. It just shows you that, what's old is new, or what's new is old, I guess. But once they got past that, then it was like, let Washington pick, and no one gainsayed that. Yeah, if this works, man, Mount Vernon might be the most, valuable real estate in the country.
Let's, on the kind of north-south theme, skip ahead a little bit again to the Civil War. The fact that D.C., its creation in this region was a compromise. Then, given that, what role did the city play in the Civil War? How did that location affect the state of play?
Well, it's the only time, of course, other than the War of 1812, where the capital was directly menaced in war. And I guess depending on your point of view, whether it was the enemy or not, in the War of 1812, pretty clearly, this, by the way, is the 210th, I have it right? Yeah, 210th anniversary of the burning of Washington by the British in 1814. But the only other time was the Civil War. And so the uniqueness so in 1812, we're invaded by Britain. In the war between the states, in the Civil War, what's so unique is that Washington sits on the border,
right,
of what remained the United States and what was the Confederacy, right? I mean, Virginia did not jump in the first wave of states to secede. It jumped later. And, if you're looking at it from the perspective, let's say, of Robert E. Lee's mansion, Arlington House, right, which is now Arlington National Cemetery, the Lee Mansion, you're looking across the Potomac at the Capitol. And once Lee decides to turn down President Lincoln's offer to head up all Union armies, and he says, I have to fight for my state, in my country, so to speak, as he saw it, you're now looking across the river at enemy territory. In global history, I'm not aware, and again, a reader, please, or a listener, please write in, I'm not aware of any national capital that literally sat on the border. Right. I mean, they were all, and the whole point is you have to protect your capital. It's chess, right? You have to protect the king. You have to protect your capital. But you couldn't with Washington because it was right there. So the first thing President Lincoln did, of course, was send federal troops across the border. And people often forget that Union troops occupied Arlington, the Lee Plantation, and down along the river for the entirety of the war. Because literally the Confederates could have been firing cannon into Washington from the heights across. So the first thing Lincoln did was send troops over, or one of the first things, and they held that territory all throughout the war. The second thing was an incredible network of forts built around Washington. I knew as soon as we started talking, I didn't write a note and I would forget the exact number. And because the Civil War remains the single most, popular element of American history, or period in American history, your listeners will know, but it was something like, I think it was 49 forts, if I remember, and other fortifications in what was a sort of very elongated ring. And so if you're familiar with Washington and you've ever ridden the metro past Fort Totten, well, Fort Totten was one of the forts. Fort Reno was one of the forts. If you ever went to the Maryland side of the Potomac, down the Potomac a little, there's Fort Washington. There were a whole ring of forts that were fortified with tens of thousands of Union soldiers. Perhaps the most famous, I don't know if it's the most famous, and this year is the 150th do I have it right? The 160th anniversary, yes, of the Battle of Fort Stevens. That was 1864. It was in July. It was the only time the Confederates actually invaded Washington during the war. It was the closest they came. General Jubal Early was sent by Robert E. Lee because the Union was pressing down around Richmond and Petersburg, and he wanted to divert Union troops, so they swept around. They went up to where Frederick, Maryland is today. There was a major battle, the Battle of Monocacy, which was the Union troops were commanded by General Lew Wallace, who later wrote Ben-Hur, for those who know Ben-Hur in the movies. And though the Union lost that battle, it was critical because it delayed Jubal Early by a day. And in that day, Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the Union armies, moved troops back up from the south up to Washington and to Fort Stevens, so that when the Confederates attacked Fort Stevens, they were able to be repelled. If Fort Stevens had fallen and been taken, there was a good chance that they would have started making lightning raids through and into Washington, and potentially even capturing President Lincoln. It's also famous because it is the only time a U.S. president has been under direct enemy fire. Abraham Lincoln went out to see the fighting at Fort Stevens. It wasn't hand to hand. It was the Confederates were around where the old Walter Reed military hospital was, the Army hospital up Georgia, which was about a half a mile or so away, and they were trading shots back and forth with a few probably cavalry sallies here and there, but Lincoln climbed up on the parapets, right? He's 6'4", or whatever he is. And according to legend, and a lot of it may be legend because it's a great story, first of all, the officer next to him gets shot down, and Lincoln's standing there with the stovepipe hat, and the Confederate sharpshooters are zeroing in, and a young Union officer yells at him, "Get down, you fool." And that officer supposedly was the later great jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was a Union officer, young man. So Fort Stevens, one of the forts, and critical. And again, you can go. The fort is there. It's maintained. The remnants are maintained by National Park Service, and there is a cemetery for the Union soldiers who fell. It's one of the smallest national cemeteries. And then the Confederates were buried a little bit farther north in Silver Spring. And the marker for that was actually knocked down in 2020. There used to be a Confederate marker, and that was taken down. But you can find that spot as well. So Washington was protected by forts. It was critical. It was it was the brain center for the war effort. Lincoln is getting telegrams. It's the use of telegrams. Able to run the railroads through Washington from the north with supplies down, into the south towards where the battlefields were. It really was a frontline city in a way that it wasn't in our other wars, except sort of metaphorically frontline. It really was. It was the border.
And being conscious of time, I'm just going to ask about one more war before we bring ourselves up to the present here. But yeah. I know you have a deep interest in the Cold War. DC was the front line in the Cold War in a way that honestly I hadn't really appreciated before I started reading your work, the way in which that kind of affected daily life in the city. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to how that still affects the city today, and what kind of the holdovers are from that physically or I suppose spiritually, if you want to get into it.
That's great. No, it's a great question. I think first to recognize that there is an arc. There's an arc within the arc of what I'm looking at, which is roughly a century from 1898, the Spanish-American War, beginning of American Empire, to about 9/11. I think what we call roughly the span of the American century. And I think there's an arc within that if you're looking at Washington, and that arc starts in 1929 with the Great Depression, because the response to the Great Depression demanded such intense government effort that actually started under Herbert Hoover, not FDR, but FDR took it and expanded it, which was all domestically focused, but it really developed the city massively. And then almost seamlessly, so to speak, we slid into World War II, with now the focus being external, but another enormous growth of the city, of course, from 1941 to 1945. And then almost seamlessly into the Cold War, maybe a 2-year interregnum or so, where people weren't quite sure what was going to happen. But by 1947, the die has been cast. You have NSC 68, National Security Act, and the like, and we're in an open-ended Cold War. So the Washington of today is the Washington built basically from 1929 through the Cold War. If you want to go through the whole Cold War or end it in the 80s, whenever you want to do it, in the 70s. But that's really the Washington of today, the Washington of the Federal Triangle, the Washington of the giant government department, the buildings, the departments, the national security state buildings such as CIA. A Pentagon was built during World War II, but critical, of course, for the Cold War. NSA, the naval and military hospitals, all these things that were appurtenances of empire. And then for the Cold War, it's maintained, for 50 years. And so, the Cold War, Washington is a frontline city, I would call it. It's it's not a physical frontline city like Berlin. We're used to thinking of Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. But Washington is the frontline city, and that this is where the decisions were made, just as Moscow was. And you had to protect it. And the protection now is much more difficult, right? Because you're in the age of the intercontinental bomber and then the intercontinental missile. And of course, in the early days of the space race, the fear that, the Russians would have, space stations on the moon that would launch rockets at us. So how do you defend that capital? And there was a lot of talk. Civil defense was huge in Washington during this period. If you drive along Pennsylvania Avenue and other avenues and you look at the street signs, you'll see little blue signs on top that say evacuation route, because those were the main arteries out of the city in case of a nuclear attack, or I guess potentially invasion, but no one really thought about invasion. There's the famous White House bunker, built under the White House during the renovation in the Truman years, where you could have a worldwide command bunker underneath the White House, where you could survive ostensibly a nuclear attack. And there were other bunkers outside the city. The famous one, Raven Rock, and then out in West Virginia for Congress. All of these were well known, but you had to protect the city with anti-missile sites. So around Washington, they're all decommissioned. They're basically concrete slabs. You'll find Nike anti-missile rings, just like the ring that went around Washington in the Civil War. Same idea. You had to protect the city. You had air bases, Andrews, basically more or less in the city in Maryland, but Langley down south, Langley Air Force Base. All of this designed to protect, and even, believe it or not, the idea that you're not going to let a flotilla come up the Potomac, that you would be able to defend the Potomac. So this was really critical, especially once you get to the era of the intercontinental ballistic missile. When you get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's really that Washington everywhere now is a frontline city, and Washington's a frontline city, and so there is this deep sense of can you be protected? And I know there was some debate. I haven't yet really looked at it. And again, listeners may know, debates like, well, we got to move the city. We have to move the capital like Topeka, Kansas. It has to be in the middle of the country where hopefully the missiles can't quite reach, or they're not going to be as accurate. But, the idea that a Soviet sub in October of 1962 could surface off the East Coast and launch a missile that could, arc and ballistically hit Washington within a few minutes meant that there was a permanent sense of vulnerability. And I actually mentioned, when I was in college in the 80s, Reagan again putting missiles into Europe, people thought this isn't impossible, that we're going to have a nuclear exchange again, the whole day after idea that you're going to have a nuclear exchange. And we thought about it as kids, as college students, what's going to happen? Will we even know? And I think that largely abated at the end of the Cold War. And it was punctured in 9/11, of course, because of the attack on Washington, the Pentagon being hit, and the Flight 93 that crashed in Shanksville was obviously destined either for the White House or the Capitol. We'll never know for sure, but it was destined for Washington. And so there was that sense of vulnerability. And the difference, I think, today is, and it really grew post 9/11, is the degree of internal security in Washington, right? The old idea was you would have some external security, right? Nike missile sites, fighter squadrons down at Langley that could intercept, bombers if they were coming. Nobody really thought there'd be a land war like Civil War, a War of 1812. But now it's really all about internal security, right? So when I was here in college, of course, Pennsylvania Avenue was open in front of the White House. It was a major traffic artery. People drove up and down it all day long and walked along it, without it. There were no bollards. There were no checkpoints. There was nothing. You want to get in the White House grounds, yeah. But it was a street like every other street, which is it is a little crazy if you think about it, but it seems weirdly, even with the Cuban Missile Crisis, like such an innocent time. But now the city is shut down tighter than a kettle drum everywhere you go. I think one of the most depressing sights, and this is not to argue anything about which side, anything, but I'm just saying when they put the fencing up around the Capitol.
Oh, yeah.
And they kept it up for months. It really gets at this question of, are we an open society or not? And what is the level of control? Washingtonians joke with that sort of humble brag about, I'm late because I was held up by the president's motorcade, right? And it is a pain in the butt. I remember I was actually here's a typical Washington story for you. I was testifying before Congress, and when you testify in Congress, you don't testify in the Capitol. You testify in the office buildings, right? And I got out at Union Station to walk across the Capitol Plaza to get to the Senate side. The House side. The Senate side's on the side of the Capitol that's near Union Station. I had to walk over to the House side, and it's fairly quick. It's a straight shot. So I go and I get to the Capitol and it's locked off. And it's like, what is going on? Because then you got to walk like half a mile out of your way because it's a big complex, right? And but I'm a good American, so I'm complaining about it. I'm not saluting. I'm catching that why, and I'm going to miss my thing. It turned out, I think it was St. Patrick's Day, and President Obama was visiting the House side with the Prime Minister or President of Ireland, and they locked down the whole thing. Washingtonians complain about that all the time, get to tell your funny stories like I just did. But the way that the city is locked down now, it is very different, so many layers of security. And what that means for a democratic society, obviously you can still go in to the Capitol, but it's different, and it feels different from when I was in college, and I'm sure it was way different from the 50s, and a heck of a lot different from when the president used to have open New Year's receptions, and anybody who wanted to could walk into the White House, right? I mean, we've gone along this arc, and it raises certain questions, but it's also understandable. And hopefully even talking about that will help me understand a little bit about the psychology of how Washington has changed.
Okay. I know we're going to go over time, but I have two more questions if that's good with you.
I love going over time. I don't know if your listeners are good going over time. I could talk forever. I appreciate it.
They'll be fine. They'll make it through.
No, I'm ready. And I know my answers were really long in the beginning, but so much to cover.
No, this has been amazing. So I know that historic preservation is a big interest of yours. Harkening back to the beginning of this conversation about parallels between us and Victorian London and Augustan Rome, this idea of public architecture is something that conservatives today often lament as this sort of lost art, but which seems, at least to me, to be very much alive, at least in Washington. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that and the ways that Washington preserves this long history that we've been discussing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll try to be relatively brief. Yeah, I mean, first of all, the last thing you want is for whatever reason, Washington to become, like the remnants of Imperial Rome in the 17th century, where the Forum is covered, 20 feet deep in debris, right? And if you get apocalyptic, like Logan's Run or something, that's where you are, right? So obviously we're not there, but it's in the minds of people, right? Because we have, first of all, we have Roman inspired architecture, so it's not too hard to say, gosh, one day, will the dome of the Capitol be collapsed, and will the White House just have a few pillars standing? But that can happen even without the fall of America. And so, to your point about historic preservation, it really is critical. in a city that was continually growing, especially in the 20th century. How do you preserve the past? So in 1902, Congress, the Senate came out with something called the National Capital Parks Plan, which was popularly known as the Macmillan Committee. It was a report on the park system in the national capital, but it became much more than that. It was chaired by Senator Macmillan of Michigan, if I'm not mistaken, just blanking. And it really became a plan to preserve and expand and develop the monumental core. And they had wonderful drawings and the like that came out of this. And so the Macmillan Plan still guides the development, but also the preservation or the spirit of preservation of the city. And it's done through a whole bunch of different bodies. And I'll just mention three official, one unofficial very quickly. The first one chronologically that was formed is Commission of Fine Arts, which is a very powerful, very, very important and fascinating federal body that is essentially charged with the aesthetic development of Washington, particularly in terms of buildings and what buildings are approved, and preserving buildings. So there are areas of Washington under the jurisdiction of the CFA, which is appointed by the president, federally appointed, to say, no, you can't tear this down, or you can't redevelop this, or you can't do certain things because of the importance of these buildings, and also weighing in on the public spaces, because as a democracy, as a republic, and a Republican democracy, and a federal Republican democracy, there's a whole ethos of how we represent ourselves to ourselves and to the world, right? We don't build castles. We don't build palaces. We don't build central forts like the Kremlin. The Kremlin is a fort, if people don't know that. That's why the walls are like that. We are a democracy of equals. And so the president's house, that's what it's called. It's called the president's house. We call it the White House. I actually prefer the term executive mansion. I think it's a little bit more elegant. If I were elected president, I would change the stationery to executive mansion.
I'll make a note.
Thank you. Please. And, they are grand. The Capitol is one of the most beautiful buildings on earth. It really is. It's not the most beautiful, but I think it's one of the most beautiful. And yet it's the people's house and the president's house, right? And so how we represent ourselves, there's actually an interesting and still somewhat vociferous group of people who don't like the Lincoln Memorial. They think it's like a Greek temple or a Roman temple with, instead of Zeus sitting there deciding the fate of mankind, it's President Lincoln. They think it's not Republican, it's not Democratic. And there's I don't agree, but I can see what they're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a whole question of that. What the Macmillan Plan was concerned about was not just the buildings, but the space, that you opened up space, and that space then became democratic because people could move through it. And the best example of that, of course, is the National Mall. And the front yard of America, sometimes it's called, just like Pennsylvania Avenue is called America's Main Street, which it never really has become, unfortunately, despite all sorts of revitalization projects. The mall, in some ways, really is our front lawn. So this preservation is really critical. The Commission of Fine Arts, as I mentioned, was the first body designed to try to uphold aesthetic standards. The second critical body is the National Capital Planning Commission, which went through a few different iterations of name, but is next month, June, or it might be possibly early July, is celebrating its 100th anniversary, its centennial. Or centenary, I guess. And the NCPC, which is still its federally appointed body, is charged with the overall development of the monumental core in the city, again, inspired by and following in many ways the Macmillan Plan. But they're, for example, the ones who will say you can't put a freeway through here, or you can't tear this down and build a park. And obviously National Park Service becomes critical in that too. National Park Service holds hundreds of pieces of property within Washington. Big ones like the President's Park, that's the formal name for the compound of the White House, and the ellipse and Lafayette Square is called President's Park. run, managed by the NPS. The National Mall, the NPS manages it. So the National Park Service is critical, working with the NCPC, the National Capital Planning Commission, to maintain the openness and the accessibility and the elegance of Washington, but also allowing for development. And then there is both the DC, the DC Planning Preservation Office, and then there's a private. So that's municipal, and then there's a private, the DC Preservation League, which is a private citizens group that does really wonderful work, as all of these groups do, but does really wonderful work on identifying important buildings throughout the city and advocating that they not be knocked down. An old, wonderful, he's unfortunately passed, historian, historic preservationist James Good wrote a book called Capital Losses, which, if anyone wants to, it's one of those big, gigantic, it's a scholarly book, but it's also a coffee table book about all the amazing buildings that were torn down, including, for example, the 7 buildings, which were built in the late 1700s, one of the first buildings built in Washington to house federal offices. Almost all of them were knocked down for development. We've lost so much in Washington, and yet now we're at a point where, and really for the past century, where that sort of pell-mell destruction is at least slowed down. And it's still contentious. There's a lot of back and forth over, how do you, the Washington metro region has 6 million people now. The city has just under 700,000. It's a really big area, and it's a very small area overall. Obviously, you've got now urban sprawl out into Maryland and Virginia, but the district and the very inner ring is very, very tight and small. And so you can't, you can't say, well, there's no development. The question is what kind. And so now what's interesting is it's not one-stop shopping, one place decides. You have all of these different groups interacting, and they don't always agree, and there's sometimes controversy, and that controversy has been in the past as well. But it really marks Washington, maybe, again, I don't know because I don't know other cities, as probably the most urban planned and the most historically preservation-minded city in the country, and for good reason. So much of our history has happened here and continues to happen here, as well as representation of our history from all around the world. So yesterday, and I'm embarrassed, I didn't even know, there is a National Law Enforcement Memorial, National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. It's located in between the National Building Museum, which is the old patent office, and the old DC City Hall, which is now the DC Court of Appeals. And it is for the thousands of police officers who have lost their lives in the line of duty. And like the Vietnam Memorial, it is carved with all of their names. It's concrete and it's lower. And yesterday, DC was filled with thousands of police officers from around the country because yesterday was the Memorial Day. And I walked over there. I happened to be down. I didn't know otherwise. I was downtown for a meeting, and I walked up. I just happened to walk up to it. And from all around the country, honor guards, police honor guards from every city you can imagine were taking turns standing watch at the memorial. It was one of the most moving things I've ever seen, with pictures and flowers and cards and notes, and family members were there. It was extraordinarily moving. Tear-inducing, truly. Now, almost every one of those officers lost their lives, not in DC, but their memorials here. Just like the Vietnam Memorial is here. The World War II Memorial is here. So the space of DC is not just obviously for DC, it's for the country. And so there's a huge, an ongoing debate over how do you fit all of this into DC and who gets to be represented in DC. Obviously, there are memorials in other parts of the country to other people and other groups and other moments in our history, but there's something very special and important and unique about having it in DC, even if it's nothing federal, like the law enforcement agencies. 99.9% of them were not federal. There were some actually. The police forces of the armed forces, or the police forces of the Department of the Interior, and the like. And some of those people were represented as well. Those heroes were represented as well. But again, you're talking about a policeman or policewoman who was shot in Anchorage, Alaska, right? Or Santa Fe, New Mexico. But their memorial nationally is here. And so that becomes part of that debate. And it's an incredible one to sort of witness in the process, because again, it goes to this question of who, as a people, how do we remember our history? And not just remember it, how do we celebrate it? And then when we do that and we decide to do it and it's approved in Washington through whatever very long, undoubtedly long bureaucratic process it takes, then it's here. And it's here where millions of people visit every year. And maybe, most of them just go to the mall, the Smithsonian, the White House, and the Capitol. But if you look around at a few places, you'll see commemoration of Americans from all over this country in every possible field. And that's something that we really need to remind us that we are all Americans. If, again, not to get into it because I know we're over time, but the polarization in the country, which you can focus on endlessly, and a lot of us do, and everywhere, but particularly here, it's the game of choice is politics. That can eat your soul away, and it can overtake everything. Well, then you need to go and you need to walk to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, or the Korean War Memorial, or the fallen law, the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, in one of many ways, and there are other ways, to remember that we are all Americans together, and how incredibly critical that is, because in Rome, they may have lost that feeling of being Roman, of being united. And when you lose that feeling, it has real world effects.
Well, I think you actually answered my last question along the way. And what a stirring note to end on. This was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, Michael. And your Substack will be linked in the show notes.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, and mostly just letting me talk through some of the ideas that I'm grappling with. And I hope for your listeners it wasn't too distracting.
No apologies. I won't allow it. Well, there you have it, Madisonians. Dr. Michael Auslin on the history of Washington, D.C., as he calls it, the New Rome. Please do subscribe to Dr. Auslin's Substack, The Patowmack Packet. It's linked in the show notes. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a rating or review. We really appreciate it. If you want to learn more about the James Madison program and what we do here on Princeton's campus, please check us out at jnp.princeton.edu. There, you can sign up for our mailing list. You can see the recordings of previous events that we've had here on Princeton's campus, and also our schedule of upcoming events. For updates on us, you can also follow us on social media, on X at Madison Program, as well as on Instagram and Facebook. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week here on Madison's Notes.